Okay, welcome to the next part of the video. Here we're going to discuss using the debugger. Then we're going to talk about writing our own code. And finally, we're going to end up with writing and debugging tests. Okay, so in this part 2, we're given this function, IamBroken. And this function is supposed to take in a string and return the lowest ASCII code for any of the letters in the string. So let's digest this for a second, right? An ASCII code is just a number representation for any letter. So let's find out what the ASCII representations are for B, C, and the letter A. So one thing that's really neat about Node is if we type Node into our console, we get this kind of command line thing where we could just type JavaScript code. So this makes it really easy to execute on the fly. So console.log, right? So if we want to print hello, we would do this, and we can see that gets printed right to the console. So we can just execute code in here without writing it into a file. It's very convenient. So let's find out what the character codes for A, B, and C would be. First, let's start with A. So we use the string or character method car code at. We want the 0th index in the string. Oh, it's a capital C for code. There we go. So 97 for A. For B, it'll be 98. And then let's do C. One thing to note is that in JavaScript, you can interchange double quotes and single quotes. They're exactly the same thing, so there's really no difference at all. And then for C, it would be 99. So if this function is supposed to return the highest character code in the string, we would expect it to return 99, right? Let's see what it's actually returning by running npm run start. So let's run this program and see what gets logged. Okay. If we run this prod, we see that it turns out that it's printing 97, right, which is the lowest character code. So obviously there's some bug. So we can go into setup.ts and look over this function and see if we find the issue. Or, what's better, we can use the debugger, right? This is especially going to be helpful if you have really complicated code where you can't just glance at it and find the bug. So let's try using the debugger. So we have two options for setting the breakpoints. So the breakpoints, this is the point where execution is going to halt and where we're going to kind of take manual control of the execution. So we know that the issue is somewhere inside of IamBroken. So we really have two options. We can set a breakpoint when we get to this line 50, or we can just go into setup.ts and set a breakpoint right here when we enter the function. Let's just put it right here. I don't even want to open the other file. We're already here. Let's put it here, and then we'll step into that. So the next natural question is, how do we even open the debugger? How do we turn on the debugger? Well, it's very easy, and we've already provided the script inside of this .vscode folder, so you don't need to worry about it. You just click this little debug button right here on the left on the tool strip, and then all you have to do is click the start debugging button up here. So once that starts, it'll take a second to attach the debugger and start up, but we'll see in a second that we're halting execution right here on this line 50, just as we would expect, since this is where we put the breakpoint. Okay, on the left here, we have a whole number of things that are all very, very cool. So we have this top part here, which will show values of all the variables right now, which is very good for us to know, right? We can make sure that things are what we expect them to be. We have, we can watch variables as well. We're not going to do that now, but if you have a lot of variables, that gets very helpful. There's the call stack, which, you might want to know. It's not super helpful right now, though, for us, so we can minimize both of those. Okay, let's step into this function, right? The error has to be somewhere inside of this IamBroken function, so we want to go inside of it. So instead of using the step over, which would just let this execute and move us on to the next one, we're going to use this button, step into. Okay, so now we have stepped into the function inside of setup.ts, and now we're at this first line here, line 12. So highest is going to be set to the character code of the string at index 0. We're pretty sure that char code at is correct since, it's a standard method on the string class. So let's just assume it's correct. So we don't want to step into it. It's probably very complicated. So let's just step over it. We can see here on the left that highest has been set to 98, which is what we would expect, right? Because the char code for B, as we saw earlier, is 98. Now in this for loop, we're going to set I to 0, and then we're going to check if I is less than s.length, which it is, so we can enter the for loop. Now we're going to set current again to s.carcode at I is 0, so this should be again 98. We can see that it is. Now we're going to do a comparison. Is 98 less than 98? Obviously not, so we shouldn't be entering this conditional. Okay, great, we're not. We're incrementing I, right? So we increment I, so I is now 1. We check if I is less than or equal to length. It still is, because length is 3. So now we're going to set current to the second index. So this is C, right? As we saw earlier, this is 99. So now, obviously, on line 18, we can see this is where it reassigns the highest, which gets returned here. So now we should be entering, right? We should be entering this conditional. But we're not. So we can see already where the issue is in this conditional. So just to verify that, finally, our I is going to be 2. At the second index, we're going to get the character code for A, which is 97. And we can see now we do end up entering this conditional. Obviously, we shouldn't. So now we can see that the issue is that this less than sign should be a greater than sign. So we can see that we exit the for loop. Highest is 97. It should be 99. We exit this function, and then we print out that result. So we can see right here 97 gets printed, which is obviously incorrect. We found the issue, so let's end the debugger. We can go into the setup.ts file and make the simple fix of switching this into a greater than. And now if we rerun our code using npm run start, we'll see that it's printing out 99, which is obviously the correct value. So we fixed this using the debugger. Awesome. All right, for the final part in this series, we're going to take a look at writing our own code. We're going to take a look at writing and debugging tests for that code, and then we're going to look at generating the submission for Gradescope, which then you can upload. So we're going to be asked to write this my first function, which is, as all functions that we're going to be dealing with, we're going to implement it in setup.ts so we can see the skeleton. You might be wondering, why is it already returning something? Well, this is just so that there's no errors immediately, right? We specify that we return a Boolean, so we have to have that. But we can delete that for now. This is just nonsense. Okay, so let's first read what we actually have to do. So your function should take a number as input and return false if the number is non-negative, or odd, true otherwise. So before we write any code, let's just take a look at some examples of numbers and determine if they should be true or false, so we get a full picture of what we actually have to do. So let's take a look at the number 2. So 2 is not odd, but it is non-negative, right? So we want to return false. 3 is odd, but it's, again, positive, right? It's odd and positive, so we definitely return false. 0 is non-negative, so again, we return false. Negative 1. Negative 1 is negative, so we don't return false because of that, but it's odd, so we still return false. Finally, the only case in which we return true for this function will be negative 2, or any negative even number, right? Because then it is not non-negative, because it's negative, and it's even. So in this case, we'll return true. So let's write this function. It'll be very easy. Return. So basically, what we need to check are two things. We need to check that the number is greater than, it's less than 0, right? Because it has to be negative. And we'll also have to check that it's even. So we'll say input. To check if a number is even or odd, we can do it very easily by using the modulo operator. So basically here we're checking if we divide the number by 2, do we have a remainder? If we don't have a remainder, it's even. If we have a remainder, that remainder is not going to be equal to 0. This is going to be false, which makes everything false. Okay, so we've implemented our function. We're pretty sure it's correct, but obviously we can't be 100% sure, especially if it's a more complex function, so we'll want to write some tests. To do that, before we do that, let's just make sure that if we run this function, it'll do some things. So we have this code written here, so let's run it using npm run start. And this will, again, run our main file. So obviously for 5, we expect false. For 4, we would also expect false. And for 0, we'd expect false. And so on, right? We went through all the cases earlier. We don't have to do that again. But it's good to think of all these cases now because now we can implement them in our tests. Let's have a look at the test files. How are the tests set up? What do we need to watch out for? So at the very top of the test file, you'll see that we're going to import our function from the setup file. So we're going to import my first function, so now we're able to use it in our tests. Then for each test group, so in a regular assignment, you'll have multiple functions. You'll wrap each of them in a describe statement, right? So inside of describe my first function are going to be all the tests for my first function. Then we're going to pass an arrow function. Inside of this arrow function, you'll learn more about arrow functions in lecture, so don't be too intimidated by this right now. But in here, we're going to use it to describe individual tests. So this is one individual test. Let's have a look at what this test does and how it works. So this test returns false for all positive numbers. First, we're going to generate a random positive number between 1 and 1000. We just do that here. You can take a look at this yourself. We're going to generate the output by calling the function we imported, my first function. This is the function we're trying to test with this input. Finally, we're going to use expect the output to be falsy. Expect is really, really cool. It allows us to do many things. For example, I'll just show the list of a bunch of these. You can take a second to read through these yourself. But there's a ton of things you can do with this expect statement that'll be really helpful in testing. So I encourage everyone to take a look at the documentation for that, which we'll have linked. Okay, so this is how we define our first test. We see that there's two other tests. This test has an issue. We'll end up using the debugger, and this test we'll implement ourselves. So first, before we do that though, how do we just run all of our tests, right? That's very important for us to know. So let's open a new terminal, and it's very similar to how we started the program. We just simply type npm run test. This will run all the tests in the test suite. So it's just going to take a second. We can see that now the tests are running. And then once that completes, we can see that this first test passed, which is great. We can also see that the third test passed, but that's just because there's nothing in it, so it does nothing. The second test fails, so this is bad, right? We want it to pass. So let's use the debugger on this test. How do we use the debugger on a test? Well, like before, we want to, once we enter this test, we're going to set a breakpoint. And then somehow we have to run the debugger, right? We have to do it slightly differently than we did before. But let's first read what this test is supposed to do. Return true for all even negative numbers, right? So we have to make sure that we're generating an even negative number. Let's run the debugger. So all we have to do is we have to click on this dropdown and click debug tests instead of debug main, right? We want to debug the tests. And then click the run button. So that's all we really got to do here. Take a second for the debugger to attach and get itself together, and then we'll see that the execution halts on line 18 here, where we set the breakpoint. Okay, so first we can see that we generate a number. We can see that number is -485. So obviously we need to generate a negative even number. Right now we have a negative odd number, so let's see what happens next. If the number is even, so this conditional now checks if the number is not even, the input is set to the number, otherwise it's going to be set to the number -1. We already see the issue. If the number is even, then the input should just be set to the number, otherwise we have to decrement 1 to make it even. So we can see that obviously now this output is going to be false because the output is false, but it's not truthy, so the output is not true. So this test is going to fail. Okay. So if we were to fix this test, we'd simply change this exclamation mark to an equal sign. And then if we run these tests again, we don't need the debugger to do this now because we found the problem. npm run test. Now hopefully this test will also pass. Oh, it still has the debugger, so let's exit that menu and kill the debugger. There we go. Okay. All right, so this test is passed. Finally, let's worry about the last test. 0's input returns false. I'll let you all pause here to see if you can work on this yourself, and then we'll come together and implement this test. Okay, hopefully you have implemented the test, you've been able to run it, and it passes. So we'll want to design this very close to this first test, right? So first, we need some input, and in this case, the input's always going to be 0, because 0 is input. That's our test, right? So let's make this a constant value, because this value is not going to change. We'll call it input, and we'll set it equal to 0. Then we'll generate the output using the function. And we'll use our myFirst function, which we've imported, on the input that we've generated here. And then finally, we want this to return false, right? This has to return false. So we can use our expect. We expect the output to be falsy. Okay. One final thing I want to point out, right? Once you end up having a lot of tests, and in the later homeworks, also in the first homeworks, you'll end up having like 20, 30, 40 tests. So running this is just going to be a big list of tests, so it can get very overwhelming to see what you're looking at. So one more very helpful extension that we can install is called Jest. So let's install the Jest extension, it's just this one right here. Once we've installed this extension, we can see that we have individual start buttons next to all of the tests. So now, if we only want to run this test right here, we can just click this button, and we'll see that this is running. It also gives us this helpful menu right here on the right. And then we can see the test has run, and it'll just show us right here on the left that it's passed. So it'll show next to all of the tests the status. So this is very helpful for us. Hopefully this has all made sense, and let's jump into the last thing we need to know, right? So let's say you've written all your code, you've written all the tests that you need to write, and you're ready to submit to Gradescope. So what we're going to want to do, instead of zipping files yourself, right? No one wants to do that. It gets messy. You might forget a file. We've made it very simple for you. I'm going to open up a terminal and type npm run build :submission. We'll let that run. And this can take a second because it's going to build your entire submission right now. So we can see that this is also automatically going to format the code to make all the code look nice and pretty. Then it's going to use build, which is one of our scripts, to use TSC to compile the TypeScript into JavaScript. And once that completes, it'll zip the submission, and we can see that it's created this zip file right here. If we open this in a file explorer, you can now just drag and drop this file into the Gradescope submission, which will be linked on Canvas. But also you can just go to Gradescope and submit it there. That's the basics on how to use the setup that we've provided. Hopefully you've been able to follow along with the posted starter code, and I hope that we see you in office hours and in labs, and that you post any questions to CampusWire.